This is the download from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Manuela Bedoya.
And I'm Shreya Sharma.
The download is brought to you by Magellan AI. Track the trends in spend, ad load, podcasts on YouTube, and more with Magellan AI's advertising benchmark report for Q4, available now. You can find a link in the description or visit magellan.ai.
This week, podcasts are coming to YouTube Music. Digiday breaks down the Google antitrust case. Pod News publishes a deep dive on podcasting in Japan and how marketers are looking at Q2. Let's get started.
Since the release of the YouTube podcast webpage last year, there has been very little concrete feature announcements from YouTube, leaving some skeptical of Google's commitment. After all, podcasting has been burned by companies veering away from podcast support at the 11th hour. Last Thursday, during the Hot Pod Summit at On Air Fest, YouTube podcast lead Kai Chuck took to announce YouTube is releasing a beta version of podcasting functionality for YouTube accounts, as well as adding podcasts to YouTube Music in the near future. Here's a quote from Chuck, pulled from J. Clara Chan's coverage. The message that I would hope folks are taking away is YouTube at large, independent of YouTube Music, is looking to better support podcasters and recognizes that podcasting is generally an audio-first medium. End quote. Once implemented, YouTube Music listeners will likely have a comparable podcast listening experience to current offerings with Spotify and Apple. As reported on the official YouTube blog in August, YouTube Music has a subscriber base of around 80 million users split across YouTube Music and YouTube Premium. Not bad, but it pales in comparison to YouTube's over 2 billion users. According to Chuck, there are intentions to bridge the gap between the platforms. Here's another quote from Chuck, pulled from Ariel Shapiro's coverage. I don't expect podcasts to only live on YouTube Music. That's the only way that people consume podcasts on YouTube, Chuck said. We expect there to be kind of a back and forth between the two. End quote. Shapiro then says Google product lead for podcasting, Steve McLendon, gave an explanation of how the feature would ultimately work, describing seamlessly continuing a podcast episode that had been started on a desktop computer watching YouTube to an audio feed while driving home from work. While not directly related to podcasting, another promising audio feature was announced for YouTube last week. Multi-language audio tracks. Currently in beta and piloted by popular content creators like Jimmy Mr. Beast Donaldson, the feature will allow creators to upload alternate audio tracks to dub new and existing videos in different languages. If properly supported and implemented, this could have interesting implementations for podcasting in the future. In the February 21st issue of the Sounds Profitable newsletter, Brian Barletta detailed several ways Google could win back trust from skeptical podcasters and show they're committed to integrating with the industry. One way mentioned was a commitment to RSS ingestion and integration. While a step in the right direction, Chuck's announcement didn't completely deliver this. Here's another quote from Chuck. Definitely support for RSS is something we are looking at. I would say probably initially, we will leverage RSS to make it easier for podcasters to bring shows to YouTube. In terms of future plans and things like that, we're sort of exploring what should our goal be. End quote. So, podcasts are coming to YouTube. Kind of. As Chuck said, the current version of RSS integration is less integration and more an automatic import to bring the file into YouTube's ecosystem. Promising steps are being made towards YouTube integrating into podcasting, instead of YouTube turning podcasters into YouTubers who occasionally upload audio elsewhere. But we're not out of the woods yet.
Back in late January, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Google, alleging the search engine giant had created a monopoly in the ad tech market as well. The 155-page lawsuit argues that Google has used a combination of ad tech tools like their ad exchange and publisher ad server to corner the market on programmatic ads. Last week, Digiday senior media editor Tim Peterson published a brief piece that collected and presented the first 3 installments of a series of videos explaining the DOJ's lawsuit, as well as the basic fundamentals of ad tech needed to understand the ongoing situation. The crux of the lawsuit centers around Google having a DSP in the form of Display and Video 360, an ad exchange platform in ADX, and a publisher ad server in Google Ad Manager. A tech stack that, if leveraged a certain way, would give preferential treatment to Google's interests. Here's a quote from the DOJ lawsuit. By allowing only its own publisher ad server effective access to important, unique Google Ads demand, Google could force publishers to adopt and remain on its publisher ad server. Other ad servers could not compete to offer a similar product. End quote. The situation is further exacerbated by Google's sheer size in the ad tech industry. According to the lawsuit's allegations, Google's market share for ad servers jumped from 60% in 2008 to 90% in 2015. The DOJ cites a 2016 customer presentation in which Google stressed this 90% market share, describing their publisher ad server as a quote-unquote de facto choice. Even now, as alleged by the lawsuit, header bidding can't escape Google's first look clauses. Here's a quote from the lawsuit. Critically, through dynamic allocation, Google's ad exchange always received this last look advantage, essentially a right to buy any impression as long as it had at least one advertiser willing to match the competing bid price from the header bidding auction. End quote. Podcasting as an industry has many paths in front of it right now. If we choose to go down a handful of current options available, we might find ourselves in the same situation that digital found themselves in with Google. Let's hope podcasting doesn't get to a point where even header bidding can't break free of one company's control. It has been said before on the download and it bears repeating. Independent third parties are vital for a healthy industry.
The first in a series of deep dives into different East and Southeast Asian podcast markets by Guang Jinyo was published last week on Pod News. A sequel to January's Japan, a Country Overview, this deep dive examines the driving factors behind an industry-defining podcast, such as Serial, explores Japan's existing podcast industry, and explores what could be a podcast category driver in Japan to the point of reaching a similar impact to Serial. It's an uphill battle in Japan for sure. A snapshot of podcast listener statistics out of the internet population in several countries shows podcasting's weekly reach is just 4% of the total population in a country with an 83% internet-connected population. For comparison, the same graph's data for the US shows 26% weekly reach to the population. Some significant barriers to entry do stand in the way of a thriving Japanese podcast industry. Popular commercial radio syndication apps like Radico undercut the motivation of radio to repackage segments as podcasts. Japan has far stricter content copyright laws than the US, and most how-to guides built for educating new podcast listeners are only available in English. From the article, but is it all doom and gloom? Not exactly. TBS, Tokyo Broadcasting Station, the first radio broadcaster in Japan, is planning to release a large number of new original podcast programs on all the mainstream podcast outlets, which means that they see value outside of Radico. COVID also encouraged a surge of creators globally, including Japan, which means more people are willing to tackle the complicated copyright laws and more people are willing to explain them to creators. End quote. Global podcasting is growing, and as this deep dive shows, some markets remain full of untapped potential with only a few speed bumps in the way of mainstream adoption.
This week, Digiday's Christina Momlos published an article exploring marketers' tempered expectations for the upcoming quarter, as well as hopes for Q3 and Q4. Here's a quote from the article. Marketers are spending, and there are signals that spending could pick up in the second half of the year with more new business pitches happening now, according to agency execs. But there is still a cautious optimism, as one agency exec put it when asked to sum up marketers' current mood. At the same time, spending is down compared to the second quarter of last year. Agency execs say that it's down roughly 10%, a smaller percentage than many had expected earlier in the year. And marketers are holding on to dollars longer and seeking more flexibility rather than longer-term commitments. End quote. As covered in similar stories over the past few weeks in the download, the general tone of the industry is that brand building has taken a back seat to performance marketing. Stacey Stewart, U.S. Chief Marketplace Officer at told Digiday that the marketers are focusing on short-term planning and flexibility over signing long-term deals. Creative agency Mechanism CEO Jason Harris reports some marketers have adopted a keep calm and carry on strategy, by continuing to spend and accepting lower profits for higher revenues. Stewart's comment about flexibility is backed up by Harris, who also reports having seen it bleed over into new business pitch practices. While new clients are focusing on taking baby steps with test projects, he also sees promising indications for the future. Here's a quote from Harris in the article. "Pitch activity tells me clients are planning the back half of the year to be busy," said Harris. "I think this year will turn into a good year." End quote. 2023 rolls onward. Q1 has developed into something far less terrifying than predicted 4 months ago, and the vast majority of us are still alive and kicking. Despite it all, it's hard not to have hope for the rest of the year. It might not be the most stellar year on record, but signs point to good things. Finally, it's time for our semi-regular roundup of articles we're calling Quick Hits. These are articles that didn't quite make the cut for today's episode, but are still worth including in your weekend reading. This week's articles are the 2023 IAB Australian Audio State of the Nation report released yesterday and is now available for download. Check it out now for the latest data from Australia, including the finding that 78% of media agencies intend to increase investment in podcast advertising this year. And in Sounds Profitable's weekly series Data Decoded by Tom Webster, Tom takes a look at a graph from Podsite's newest quarterly benchmark report. Pre-roll ads now have higher conversion rates than mid-roll, but what could that mean? Tom breaks it down in 5 minutes on the Sounds Profitable YouTube channel.
And that was The Download, brought to you by Sounds Profitable. Today's episode was built using Spooler and hosted on Art19. Find out more at spooler.fm and art19.com. I know we went through today's stories fast, so be sure to check out the links to every article mentioned right in your podcast listening app or on soundsprofitable.com/thedownload. And thank you for sticking with us as we bring you the top stories you might have missed from the past week. I'm Manuela Bedoya.
And I'm Shreya Sharma. Our producers are Brian Barletta, Gavin Gaddis, and Tom Webster. Special thanks to Art19 for hosting The Download. And thanks to you for joining us. Robot?
Download complete.